The high desert of Oregon is not a place that welcomes the soft or the small. It is a landscape of jagged basalt and sun-bleached sagebrush where the wind carries the scent of ancient dust and forgotten things. In the spring of 1952, the town of Ritter was nothing more than a collection of weary structures clinging to the earth. It was a place where people went to be left alone, but the land has a way of taking more than you offer. I have spent years looking into the holes in our reality, and this case remains one of the most jagged shards in the pile. It is a story that defies the physics of a 2-year-old body and mocks the logic of our supposed safety. Somewhere in the archives of the Unexplained, there is a file for Keith Parkins, and it smells of ozone and cold creek water. It was April 10th, 1952. The world was still recovering from the Great Wars, and people in the rural stretches of the West lived by the rhythm of the sun and the soil. Keith Parkins was only 2 years old, a tiny flicker of life in a very big and very empty world. He was at his grandfather's ranch just outside of Ritter. The air that morning would have been crisp, carrying the residual bite of a winter that did not want to let go. 2-year-olds are chaotic engines of curiosity, but they are limited by the length of their legs and the fragility of their lungs. They do not wander far because the world is too heavy for them to push through for very long. But Keith was about to become a ghost in his own backyard. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, the boy was outside. His grandfather was nearby, engaged in the soul-crushing labor of ranch life. It only takes a second. That is the phrase we hear in every single one of these cases. It only takes the time to wipe the sweat from your brow or to check a fence post. When the grandfather looked up, the space where the boy had been was empty. There was no scream. There was no sound of a struggle. There was just the sudden oppressive silence of the Oregon brush. The ranch was surrounded by miles of nothingness, and the terrain was a nightmare of steep canyons and thick timber. A 2-year-old in that environment is like a candle in a hurricane. The panic did not wait. It arrived with the first breath the grandfather took when he realized the boy was gone. Neighbors were called and the word spread through the thin telephone lines of the county like a fever. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, there were hundreds of men on the property. They were ranchers and hunters, men who knew how to track a wounded deer through a blizzard. They looked for the small impressions of a child's shoe in the soft earth. They looked for broken twigs or a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn. They found nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the boy whole without leaving a single crumb behind. As night fell, the temperature began to plummet. In that part of Oregon, the heat of the day is a lie, and the night reveals the truth of the high desert. It dropped below freezing. The wind began to howl through the draws, and the searchers huddled in their heavy coats, wondering how a boy in light clothing could possibly survive. They had flashlights and lanterns cutting weak yellow paths through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to push back. There is a specific kind of dread that settles in when you are looking for a child in the dark. It is a weight in the pit of your stomach that tells you that you are already too late. The men moved in lines, calling out a name that only the wind answered. The geography of the area is crucial to understanding the impossibility of what happened next. To the west of the ranch lay a mountain range. It was not a gentle slope, but a series of ridges and valleys choked with snow and ice. Beyond that were more canyons and more timber. A man on horseback would have struggled to navigate that terrain in the dead of night. A 2-year-old boy wearing only a light jacket and pants should not have been able to make it more than a few hundred yards before the cold or the fatigue stopped him. But Keith Parkins was not following the rules of human endurance that night. The search continued through the long, frozen hours of the early morning. They checked the wells and the outbuildings. They checked the creek that ran near the house, thinking he might have fallen in and been carried away. But the creek was shallow and clear. There was no sign of him. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed over the mountains, the searchers were exhausted and grim. They were no longer looking for a boy. They were looking for a body. They expected to find him curled up under a bush or wedged into a rock crevice taken by the hypothermia that kills so quietly in the dark. They had no idea how far they were from the truth. 19 hours after he vanished, a group of searchers were working a ridge 8 miles away from the ranch. Let that number sink into your mind for a moment. 8 miles. For a 2-year-old to cover 8 miles of rugged mountain terrain in 19 hours, he would have had to move at a pace that is nearly impossible for an adult on a clear trail. He would have had to climb over ridges and cross multiple fences. He would have had to navigate through freezing darkness without a light. And yet there he was. They found him face down in the mud of a dry creek bed. He was unconscious, but he was breathing. When they rolled him over, they expected to see a face torn by briars or bruised by falls. Instead, they found a child who looked like he had simply been placed there. His clothes were remarkably intact given the distance he had supposedly traveled. He was suffering from exposure, but he was alive. The men who found him were stunned into a heavy silence. They looked back toward the mountain range they had just crossed, and then looked down at the small, shivering body in the dirt. The math did not add up. 8 miles is not a distance. In this context, it is a miracle or a nightmare. If you take a 2-year-old to a high school track and tell them to run, they might get around the oval once or twice before they sit down and cry. That is less than half a mile on a flat paved surface. Keith Parkins traveled 8 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Pacific Northwest. He did it in the dark. He did it in sub-freezing temperatures. And he did it without leaving a trail that the best trackers in the state could follow. This is the point where the rational mind begins to fracture, and the shadows start to take shape. When Keith was taken to the hospital, the doctors were baffled. Aside from the expected chill in his bones, he was in relatively good condition. He didn't have the broken bones or the severe lacerations you would expect from a child wandering through rock slides and thickets. He was just tired. He was just cold. When he was finally able to speak, he couldn't explain where he had been or how he had gotten there. To a 2-year-old, the concepts of distance and time are fluid, but even so, there was a void in his story. It was as if he had been picked up by a hand that did not belong to a human and set down in a place he was never meant to go. In the years that followed, the case of Keith Parkins became a footnote in local history, but for those of us who study the missing, it is a pillar of the impossible. We see this pattern over and over again. A child disappears in a heartbeat. They are found miles away in a location they could not have reached on their own. They are found in areas that have already been searched or in places that defy the physical capabilities of the victim. There is a silence that accompanies these events. No one hears a struggle. No one sees a stranger. It is a predatory stillness that suggests something is operating just outside the frequency of our perception. Some people want to blame the mountain lions or the bears, but predators do not carry children 8 miles across mountains and leave them face down in a creek bed without a mark on them. Predators do not move with the surgical precision required to bypass hundreds of searchers. Others suggest a kidnapper. But what kidnapper takes a child through the most difficult terrain imaginable, only to leave them in the middle of nowhere 19 hours later? It makes no sense in the framework of human motivation. We are left looking at the gaps in the map and the parts of the woods where the birds do not sing. There is a theory among those who have looked into the deepest parts of this mystery. It is the idea of a temporary displacement. Some call it a portal and others call it an atmospheric anomaly. I call it a tear in the fabric of the world. It is as if some force moves through the wilderness, and occasionally it reaches out and snatches a soul only to drop it back into our world miles away. This force moves with a velocity that we cannot measure. It ignores the barriers of fences and mountains. It operates on a level of physics that we are not yet prepared to understand. And it seems to have a preference for the young and the vulnerable. The Keith Parkins case is not an isolated incident. It is a blueprint. When you look at the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the mountains of Colorado, you see the same impossible movement. A 3-year-old boy vanishes, and years later his remains are found at the top of a cliff that seasoned hikers struggle to climb. There is the case of Casey Hathaway, the 3-year-old who disappeared in the woods of North Carolina in freezing rain and was found 2 days later in a briar patch. He told his family that a bear had looked after him and kept him warm. These children are entering a world that we can only see in our nightmares, and sometimes they are allowed to return. But they never return the same as they were. The air in Ritter, Oregon still feels heavy to me. You can stand on the spot where the Parkins Ranch once hummed with life and look out at the mountains to the west. You can try to imagine a 2-year-old boy walking that distance in the dark. You can try to make the pieces fit until your head aches and your heart slows. But the truth is that the pieces will never fit because the puzzle is missing half of its parts. We live on the surface of a world that is far more complex and far more dangerous than we dare to admit. We are like ants crawling across a circuit board, unaware of the currents moving beneath our feet. As an investigator, I have learned to live with the lack of resolution. I have learned that some questions do not have answers that can be written down in a police report. Keith Parkins survived his ordeal, but he carried the mystery of those 19 hours to his grave. He was a living testament to the fact that we are not always the masters of our domain. There are things in the woods that do not have names. There are shadows that move against the wind. And there are moments when the world we know simply ceases to exist. We find them in the creek beds and on the mountain tops, and we tell ourselves stories to stay sane. But the stories are failing us. The patterns are becoming too clear to ignore. The impossible distance is a signature. The lack of tracks is a signature. The survival in extreme conditions is a signature. We are being shown something, and we are choosing to look away. We are choosing to believe in the mundane because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe in the mountain lion and the kidnapper because we can fight those things. We cannot fight a shadow that can move a child 8 miles through a mountain range in a single night. I think about Keith Parkins every time I step into the high desert. I think about the silence of that afternoon in 1952. I think about the grandfather who turned his back for 1 second and lost his world. And I think about the boy face down in the mud 8 miles away waiting for someone to find him. The woods are not our friends. They are an ancient and indifferent force that occasionally reminds us of our place in the food chain. If you go out there, keep your children close and do not trust the silence. There is a finality to these cases that leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. It is the realization that the boy was lucky. So many others never come back. So many others are never found, or they are found in pieces that tell a story of sheer terror. Keith Parkins was a messenger, but we have spent 70 years ignoring the message. The mountains do not care about your maps. The desert does not care about your search parties. And the thing that took Keith Parkins is still out there waiting for the next second when you turn your back. Look at the case of Danny Philippidis, who went missing from a ski resort in New York and ended up in California 6 days later with no memory of how he got there. Look at the case of the small children who tell stories of the tall man, or the bear, or the wolf that took care of them. These are not the hallucinations of the dying. These are the testimonies of the survivors. They have seen the other side of the veil, and they have come back to tell us that the world is not what it seems. We are just guests in a house that belongs to someone else. The sun is setting now, and the shadows are beginning to stretch across the basalt. The wind is picking up, carrying that same old scent of dust and sage. I will pack up my notes and my maps, and I will head back to the city where the lights are bright and the walls are thick. But I know that the darkness is still there, just beyond the reach of the street lamps. It is patient and it is hungry. And it remembers Keith Parkins. It remembers every single one of them. In the end, we are left with the silence. The same silence that swallowed a 2-year-old boy on a ranch in Ritter, Oregon. The same silence that sits in the back of your mind when you are alone in the woods. It is a reminder that we are small, and the world is large, and there are things that move in the night that do not follow our laws. Keep your eyes on the horizon, and your ears open for the sound of nothing. Because in the high desert the silence is never truly empty.